A celebrity changing his or her name is hardly news, and that's been happening for a long, long time. But when the recording artist Prince changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol back in 1993, people took notice. His motive for doing so was never clearly stated, though some think it may have had to do with an ongoing dispute with his record label, Warner Brothers, but we may never know. Now, I've never been tempted to change my name. I happen to be one of those lucky people that like the name they were given at birth. But if I was ever to change my name to a symbol, it would probably be this one. The and. I like the ampersand. I don't know why, I always have. I think it's cool looking. It's fun to write. And it just means and. Trust me, I looked up last week to make sure somebody in our woke culture hasn't adopted it to mean something else. And to my knowledge and Google's help, it hasn't. But I don't know. I've always liked the and. And I also think that the ampersand has a place in theology too. Now, to be certain, it can lead to big trouble. All right? We don't want to add anything to Jesus for our salvation. Jesus and, no, we don't need it. Jesus is all we need. Likewise, we don't want to add to God's Word. The book of Revelation has some stern things to say about that. We don't want to get into that hot water. But what I find in the area of theology, especially areas of conflict within theology, is that people tend to polarize. We see this in our own culture, right? You're either one or the other. And if you're one, you have nothing in common with the other side. And if they say something, then you're against it. And that happens in theology too. People take sides, and they tend to go to extremes. And when we go to extremes, we're almost always wrong. There's always something missing in an extreme theological position. What I have discovered is that more often than not, the truth is found somewhere in between. It's not either or, it's both and. My brother and I learned this lesson from our father years ago. If we would be at a family's house and they're serving dessert and they might ask, do you want cake or pie? My dad's answer was always, yes. Why choose when you can have both? Right? And I think that's good thinking, not so much for a diet, but that's good thinking when it comes to theology. Maybe both sides have something to say. And maybe the truth is when we bring them together rather than separating them apart. I think this is especially true in the subject we've been talking about, this idea of predestination. There are two sides on that theological debate. And the two sides sometimes go to extremes. And I think when they go to the extremes, they're both wrong. When they exclude the other side entirely, they're in error. But when we see it come together, we find the truth. So the title of my message this morning is The Gospel of And. And I'd like to turn to one passage of Scripture, Judges chapter 7. Judges chapter 7. You might be familiar with the name Gideon. Gideon was one of the judges that God raised up to rescue Israel when they were being oppressed by one various nation or another. Gideon was hardly a willing recipient, though, to be in God's plan. Much like Moses, when Moses was called, Gideon was very hesitant to take on the task. In fact, he asked God for several signs to confirm that this really was the case, that you're really calling me. He asked that a fleece that he would set outside of his tent. In the morning, the grass around it would be wet with dew, but the fleece would be dry. And the next morning, that's the way it was. God granted his request. Then he asked for the next night, reverse that. Make the fleece wet and the grass dry. And God did that as well. Very graciously confirmed his call on Gideon's life. So Gideon is finally convinced that he is the one to lead Israel to victory. So he amasses an army, and they are set to take on the Midianites who have been oppressing the Israelites for many years. So in chapter 7, verse 2, we read, "The Lord said to Gideon, 'You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands.'" You may want to read that again. Yeah, that's what he says. You have too many men. I've never known of a general that felt they had too many soldiers, or too many tanks, too many guns, too many armaments. No, you want as many as possible, right? We're told earlier that Gideon had an army of 32,000 men. God said, too big. Why on earth would he say that? What is God getting at? Well, the rest of verse 2 tells us. "In order that Israel might not boast against me in that her own strength has saved her." Here's the point. God does not want Israel to go around bragging and say, "Hey, look what we did. We whooped on some Midianites, and aren't we something?" So God said, in order for that not to happen, I'm going to pare down your army. And the way he does it is in verse 3. Going back to 2 to complete the thought. "The Lord said to Gideon, 'You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands. In order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her, announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead.' If you're afraid, go home." And 22,000 men did. 2/3 of the army said, "See ya," and they took off. Wow. That's quite a reduction. Gideon's thinking, okay, now I've got 10,000 men. I'm going to have to adjust my strategy a little bit here. But God wasn't done. Go on to verse 4. "The Lord said to Gideon, 'There are still too many men.'" I'm sure Gideon's thinking, "You've got to be kidding me." "Take them to the water, and I will sift them for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink." 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. The rest all got on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the other men go, each to his own place." That seems really, really strange for God to do that. Now, that first part where he said, "Let anybody that's afraid go home," that was actually in the law. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 8. Moses instructed the Israelites, the officers should tell the soldiers, "Is any man afraid or faint-hearted? Let him go home so that his brothers will not become disheartened too." So they were actually following the rules at that point. Anybody that's afraid can go home. I'm sure Gideon didn't think 2/3 of his army were going to leave, but they did. And now God has said, we're going to whittle this down some more. And he reduced them even further to where there's only 300 left. Out of 32,000, 300 are left. And God says, that's a good number. Now I can work with this. And you're going to know that you didn't do it. This is my victory. That's the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 7. But I'd like to take a different look at that. My emphasis is how the screening is done. In verse 4, the emphasis is clearly on God's action. God says, I will sift them for you. And he goes on to say, if I say this one will go with you, he will go. And if I say this one doesn't go with you, he doesn't go. Who's in charge here? God. Very clearly. God is in control of this situation. But how did God separate these men? He said, the ones who lap the water like a dog, separate them out from men who knelt down to drink. Any of you that have or had a dog, you know how a dog drinks, right? They just stick their face in it and lick. Now imagine a person at a creek or a river getting down to drink like a dog. They would literally have to flatten themselves on the ground. They're laying on their bellies, face in the water, drinking it up. That's what it means to lap like a dog. Now, the other soldiers knelt down to drink. And my guess is they used their hand to cup the water, bring it up to their mouth. And God said, we're going to separate the soldiers this way. 9,700 of them drank one way, 300 drank the other way, and God said, I want the 300. God made his choice based on the choice they made. God did not tell them, go drink in this certain way. And if anybody obeyed, they're in, and if they disobeyed, they're out. That's not what he said. He just said, have them go drink. The choice of how they drank the water was theirs. But God chose those who chose a certain way to fulfill his will. Who chose? God did, and the soldiers did. In this case, the soldiers didn't realize what they were doing. It wasn't announced ahead of time, we're going to separate who's going to go and who isn't. Go get a drink, and if you drink a certain way, you're going to go. None of that was told to them. But God still used the choice each soldier made and determined whether he was going to use them or not. So what do we see here? We see both. God chose and the men chose. And through it all, God stayed in control, he maintained his sovereignty, and ultimately God fulfilled his will. But within his sovereign control, he allowed these men to make a choice, and that choice determined whether they participated or not. You say, what's the point? My point is this. We don't have to choose between divine sovereignty and human choice. You don't have to be a Calvinist or an Arminian, because the truth is both. God chose, and they chose. Because God designed it that way. It's not either or, it's both and. We can see these truths together. He worked within the choices the men made of their own will to bring about his plan. And I believe that is a great picture of what we've been talking about for the last month. God's sovereignty is clearly seen. God's foreknowledge. Did he know what these men were going to do? Sure he did. We see God's predestination. If I say they go, they're going to go. And if I say they don't, they don't. We see God's election. I'm choosing these 300 men. But we also see the human choice of the men who decided how they were going to drink. It doesn't have to be either or. It's both and. God's sovereignty and human choice coexist. And when we see them together, it makes sense. Now, I got to admit, I thought this was pretty slick. I actually saw this a couple of years ago in Judges, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. I don't think anybody's ever thought of that before. Yeah. But just to prove that there is nothing new under the sun, this last week as I'm preparing for this message, I come across one of my dad's old favorite radio preachers, J. Vernon McGee, and he writes, "Do you know what we have here? This is one of the finest lessons concerning divine election and man's free will." Dang it. Here I thought I had something, but there is nothing new under the sun. He goes on to say, this is the way they work together. God said to Gideon, I'm going to choose the men that I want to go with you, but the way I'm going to do it is to let them make a choice. Bring them down to the water, and the ones who lap water like a dog, just going through and throwing it in their mouths, they're the ones I've chosen. You can put aside those men who got down on their knees and take their time drinking. I don't want them. My guess is that sometime in the distant past, I probably heard him say that. It registered in the back of my mind, but I forgot. And then when later on I say, oh yeah, what a great idea. Yeah, forget it. Nothing new under the sun. McGee went on to explain, you can argue about divine election and free will all you want, but it works. You cannot make it work out by arguing, but it sure works out in life. Each one of the 10,000 men in Gideon's army exercised his free will. God did not interfere with one of them as far as their free wills were concerned. Today, God, through his Son Jesus Christ, offers you a free gift of salvation. It's a legitimate offer. It is a sincere offer from God himself. As he says, all that the Father gives me shall come to me, and he that comes to me I will in no wise cast out. Now, don't tell me that you can argue about election right now. You cannot. You can come to God if you want to come. If you don't come, I have good news for you. You weren't elected. If you do come, I have good news for you. You were elected. That's the way God moves. I think he's right. We don't have to choose sides, because there's truth in both sides, and when we bring them together, we see the reality. Now, before someone objects and says, well, now you're making salvation a matter of works, take a closer look at the story. As the men were drinking from the stream, you have these two groups that emerge. You got guys that flop down on their bellies and just drank it in. And then you got the guys that kneel down and they're, cupping the water and bring it to their mouths. I can remember back in Sunday school when I first heard this story that it was the guys who was cupping the water to their mouths, and they're looking around and they're aware of where the enemy might be, and they were the ones that were really on point, and those other ones just, they're just lapping up like a dog. God was really impressed with those who cupped the water to their mouths. Problem is, those aren't the ones he chose. He chose the guys on their bellies lapping it up with their tongues. If you would think that anybody earned their way into Gideon's army, it would have been the bigger group. But God chose the other guys. They didn't earn it. God decided who was going to go. But he did it on their choice. So it's not a matter that they earned their way into God's will. And it's funny how preachers and writers have waxed eloquent about why one group should be chosen over the other. I agree with one commentator that writes, once we find ourselves asking why the lapping was a sign of a better soldier, I'm sure we're on the wrong track. God wasn't looking for the best soldiers. I think he intentionally chose the ones who were probably the worst. Why? To prove that he did it. Right? God chooses misfits. You don't believe that? Look around. Right? We're all misfits. None of us deserve to be in the family of God. But in his sovereignty, God planned out a way of salvation, and he did everything necessary to do it. And then he said, now I'm going to give you a choice. You can take it or you can leave it. I'm not going to shove it down your throat. I'm not going to drag you to heaven, kicking and screaming, saying, I don't want to go. It's here. It's all paid for, but you do have to choose it. It's all part of God's plan. And that doesn't give us power over God. As I've said before, we can't tie God's hands. That's not the point. If we say no to God, he's got a whole lot of other people he can choose from. We're the ones that miss out. He doesn't miss a beat. But he has chosen within his sovereignty to give us choices. And I believe that's where the truth lies. Warren Wiersbe writes, what significance was there in the two different ways that the men drank from the river? Since the scripture doesn't tell us, we'd be wise not to read into some weighty spiritual lesson that God never put there. And he's right. We don't have to analyze it and, this is why God. We start analyzing why God does what he does, we're going to end up in a world of hurt. Because that's above our pay grade. We don't have to. We can trust him that he does what's right. Rather than insisting that in order for God to be sovereign, he must control every element of his creation, even the decisions that his creatures make, the Bible teaches that God gave human beings the capacity to choose, and then uses those choices, the bad ones as well as the good, to bring about his will. On the other hand, insisting that man can, by exercising his free will, tie God's hands or hold his plan hostage is equally unbiblical. I think it all comes down to a very familiar passage. I know all of you know it. Ephesians 2:8-9. We are saved by grace through faith. Grace and faith. Not grace or faith. If you separate either of those to the exclusion of the other, you don't have the gospel. But together, you have God's plan. And again, for those who complain that, now you're making faith a work. Well, some Jews asked Jesus in John 6:28, what must we do to do the works God requires? And Jesus replied, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. If Jesus is going to call it a work, I'm okay with that. It's still something we're required to do. And that choice is ours. Nobody can make it for us. Nobody has made it for us. It's a choice each one of us must make. We can argue till we're blue in the face as to whether we exercise faith ourselves or whether God gives us the faith to exercise. The bottom line is this: God commands us to believe in Him, and that's a choice. Now, throughout this series, it has not been my intention to take sides. I've probably sounded like I did at times. That wasn't my intent. I believe in God's sovereignty. I believe in God's foreknowledge. I believe in predestination. I believe in election. And I believe in man's will. I believe it's all true. And only when we bring it all together do I believe that we have the truth. Now, we still can't comprehend it all because God's ways are much higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He operates in a realm we can't even comprehend. But to the degree that He has revealed it to us, we can see that within His control, He has given us a responsibility. And that choice is ours. I believe in the gospel of and. We're saved by grace through faith. And both are necessary.